Okay, so in this video we're going to talk about Pearl Harbor and the effect that it had on America entering the war. So for your heading you should probably put Pearl Harbor. Now, Pearl Harbor was the most devastating foreign attack on American soil to date. Now, if you count the invasion, well, I should say that the most devastating single time, one day attack. I mean, you can count some of the invasions, like if you want to count Lexington and Concord, you're talking, under 100 men killed in the first skirmish, versus here we've got thousands. So anyway, Pearl Harbor, it is December 7th, 1941. You have to know that date. December 7th, 1941. So on December 7th, 1941, a large group of Japanese planes fly into Hawaii, where the majority of our Pacific Fleet is stationed. We have some of our Pacific Fleet stationed in the Philippines. We have some of our Pacific Fleet stationed in Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attack and they devastate us. There are 150 airplanes destroyed, several battleships. 3 battleships are sunk, and they seriously damaged several others. And we have 2,400 American soldiers killed and another 1,200 wounded. So we have 3,600 casualties resulting from this. 3 ships sunk, several damaged, 150 planes destroyed, but it could have been worse. We were actually relatively fortunate because our aircraft carriers weren't there. They were out on maneuvers. So maneuvers, they're going and they're practicing for war. So they're playing war games essentially. Had our aircraft carriers been there and been damaged, the Pacific campaign may have been over before it started. But anyway, this attack happens, and despite the fact that it was bad, it could have been way worse, but the American response is basically, it's wartime. You've attacked us on our own soil, just like the Afghan War, where on 9/11 we were attacked on our own soil by foreign aggressors. And our response very shortly thereafter was, let's go to war. After Pearl Harbor, our response very quickly was, let's go to war. On the following day, so the next day, December 8th, 1941, FDR gives a speech in which he says that Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, that day is a date that will live in infamy. So he's saying it's going to be a day we're going to remember forever, and it's going to be a day we'll remember as something that's bad. But he says we're declaring war, essentially. So he says the day it's going to live in infamy, and Congress is going to declare war on Japan. Then Britain's going to declare war on Japan. Now this is going to get really complicated, so follow me here for a minute. So Pearl Harbor happens. Very shortly thereafter, we declare war on Japan. And Britain declares war on Japan. So America and Britain declare war on Japan. And then China declares war on the whole Axis. They don't really do anything, but they declare war on the whole Axis. December 9th, so the next day. So we have America, Britain declaring war on Japan. The next day, China declares war on the whole Axis. Okay? And then on the 11th of December, so 2 days after China declared war on the whole Axis, Germany and Italy, over here, declare war on us. So it's just within a very short amount of time, a whole lot of war declarations are being thrown about. But it all started with Pearl Harbor and the Japanese attack on us. So now let's talk about our Pacific campaign in the war. Initially, things don't go very well for us. We declare war very shortly after Pearl Harbor. and then Japan goes on to take Guam. They go on to take a couple of British possessions in the Pacific, like a couple British islands, and then they end up taking the Philippines, which were under our control at the time. So we have Pearl Harbor, and then Japan keeps making advance after advance after advance after advance, and we keep losing ground. So we try to counter these attacks in the Pacific, and our first major victory comes with the Battle of Midway, and the Battle of Coral Sea, actually, but your book doesn't give that a whole lot of credit. So we'll focus on the Battle of Midway, and you need to have that in your notes, the Battle of Midway. And this is really the turning point in the Pacific War. So we have 1941 in December, we're losing territory. January of 1942, we lose the Philippines. And then in May of 1942, we have the Battle of Midway. So ironically, it's almost midway through the year as well. But anyway, the Battle of Midway, which is a Pacific island, we stem the Japanese advance, and it really, at that point forward, we start pushing back little by little against the Japanese in the Pacific and start pushing them back toward Japan. But we're going to see that it's going to take a lot of effort, a lot of lives, and a lot of ships to actually accomplish pushing the Japanese back to Japan. So your next subheading here is the home front. So this section is going to talk about how the Americans who stayed at home and didn't go off to fight Japan initially, and then also who didn't go over to Europe to fight Germany, or Africa to fight Germany, how they held down the fort at home. There was a concept that your book covers, part of the French Revolution, which was every citizen a soldier. Or every citizen should be a soldier. And this concept is everybody is a part of the war effort in the French Revolution. Now, we kind of applied this back home in the World War II era of everybody back home has a role to fulfill, and you are just as important as the soldier on the front lines, because without you, the soldier on the front lines wouldn't get the ammunition, the food, whatever it is you're helping produce, he would not get that. Even if you're not producing anything industrially, there are victory gardens being grown, and the concept is you're saving food by eating the food you're growing. You're saving food that would be bought, so that food can go to the soldier. So even then, you're doing your part. Anyone can do their part. That's the concept here. And one thing that the government tries to do to help the war effort along is they make something called the War Production Board. So you need to have that in your notes, the War Production Board. And the War Production Board tried to regulate the economy, and they tried to make sure that soldiers and the military got what they needed first. So they actually halted a lot of construction projects that were going to be using steel, because you need steel for other stuff. So the government ordered rationing. Also, the War Production Board tried to convince companies to switch from making consumer goods to making military goods. For example, GM, General Motors, and a lot of other car makers stopped making cars and started making tanks or jeeps for the military, or planes, fighters and bomber planes. Clothing manufacturers started making blankets and uniforms. This one gets me. Hoover, like the Hoover Vacuum Company, they stopped making so many vacuums and started making fuses for the explosives that were going to be used in World War II. So, very strange if we think about it now, but it made a lot of sense back then, because we needed every one of those planes and every one of those guns and every one of those jeeps or ships or whatever it was that was being built over in the war effort, and every citizen was being a soldier by helping in that regard. Also, rationing. The government put rations on things like coffee and rubber, meat. You were rationed on gasoline, things like that. What you could get access to because the soldiers were supposed to have first dibs for the war effort. There was also the Office of Price Administration. You need to put that in your notes. Office of Price Administration. Long story short, they did price controls in the economy to try to keep prices from rising too much so that things that the soldiers needed and the people needed were affordable. And this was seen as somewhat communistic, but it was also in a time of war, and people were willing to take the risk of going a little to that extreme for the war effort. Remember, you may not remember, but during 9/11, when France wouldn't help us out, we were told by the government, don't eat French fries, call them freedom fries. Well, here everything was about victory. You had your victory garden. Well, also there was a new speed limit imposed of 35 miles per hour to conserve gasoline, and that was called the victory speed. It was the victory speed of 35 miles per hour because you going that speed helped the soldiers achieve victory overseas. Now let's talk about the changing role of women back home. For the first time in American history, women made up they made up about 36% of the workforce in the country. And it wasn't just unmarried women as it had been before. It was even married women, women with children. And this would have, without the war going on, this would have been seen as almost absurd for this time period. It would have been seen as wrong, morally wrong. But the war was on and people's ideas changed, and this is going to lead to changing ideas in the workforce later. But it took the war to change these viewpoints. This is where you get Rosie the Riveter. I don't know if you've seen the picture of the woman flexing, and she's wearing the bandana on her head, and she's the symbol of the strong American woman who works in the factory. This did cause a problem, though, for childcare. This is where latchkey kids, that's the phrase that they were called, became common because there was very little, if any, daycare. So the children whose mothers worked in the factories just had to fend for themselves while their mom was off working. Okay, last thing we're going to talk about in the videos today is the idea of taxes. The American War Bill was about $300 billion. That's a lot of money back then. And President Roosevelt thought it should be paid by a tax increase. Americans didn't like that idea at all. I mean, we never really liked tax increases. So Congress supported half of the increase that FDR wanted. So it's kind of a compromise. But basically, increased taxes happened a little bit, but not as much. But the national debt increased 6 times what it had been before the war. So the debt had gone up 6 times between start of World War II and end of World War II. Also, another thing, 1943, payroll deductions happened for income taxes for the first time. Before 1943, you just sent in whatever you owed. Now, 1943 and onward, you're going to start seeing your actual payroll deduction, so the government makes sure they get their money from you. And that's going to continue happening and still happens today.